Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships. Hello, and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and on this particular episode, I have entitled it, Know Your Own Needs. Now, one of the big things that I talk about a great deal in the podcast is communication. And the reason I mention that is because quite often when we do the relationship part of our lives, communication is something that we watch other people do it. And we have a concept about how that happens. When you watch a television show, because you're a spectator, you kind of in your mind understand how scripts are constructed. You know, there's a story, and you're watching the story unfold, and sometimes you know what's going to happen, and sometimes you don't. But that's all part of the mystery of it. But if you take that idea and think about it in terms of how you operate your life, sometimes what you wind up doing is you operate in the same way you watch things happen instead of thinking about it as you're inside of it, being inside of the relationship. And being in the relationship means you have to know something about yourself in order to be able to communicate. Now, again, communication happens in lots of forms. There's nonverbal communication, and there's touching, there's looking at things, there's giving winks, there's all of this sort of stuff. But when we're trying to verbalize what our needs are, it's important that you know what the need is. And quite often we don't. And one of the things that happens in relationships is that we sort of pair ourselves up with people who we think that they're going to read our minds. And men and women exchange this kind of misinformation all the time. And when you're in the romance phase of a relationship, it just seems like it flows. The chemistry is there, someone's intuitive. And a lot of these things happen because in early parts of relationships, we all pretty much want the same thing. But it's after time when we become a little more nuanced, and as it develops, then the details tend to come out. They tend to flesh themselves out. And this is much harder to just be able to figure out. But in how it operates is it's mostly confusion. And it's this trial and error part that sort of builds into it sort of works toward the frustration. I mean, again, when you're in the honeymoon phase, all of this stuff seems to just work itself out. But when you're further into the relationship and things are operating sort of on guesswork or on confusion, then it takes a strain on the relationship. I'm going to talk about that after this short break, and we're going to talk about some strategies on how to fix that. So stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. And on this particular episode, I am going to talk about some strategies for being able to get out of the fog of the communication and about knowing your own needs. And knowing them, and in this episode, what I'm really trying to focus on is not just knowing your own needs, but being able to communicate that. And I've emphasized many times about how important communication is into getting your needs met. But you have to know what they are. And knowing what they are, how do you find out what those things are? Quite often, we observe other relationships, we read things, and we sort of imagine ourselves in those situations and say, well, that would be nice. And then you try to find somebody who will fit those needs. Well, there's a lot of trial and error obviously in that aspect. And of course, relationships have that. And sometimes relationships are about endurance and learning tolerance for the other person. That's part of the give and take nature of it. But as we really try to figure out what our own needs are, it's quite often we get in conversations and people can share other experiences that they've had. And it's sort of a vicarious way of learning. But when you really insert yourself in your own life and you have experiences, then that's the thing that I'm talking about being able to come from. And it's from a place of experience. Because when you've not really had a chance to check it out, you don't even know if it works. But it's about having the life, what that you want, and then finding someone who fits that or helps make that better. But going back to an example of an experience in life, well, we all have friends and associates that we do things with. And it's in these kinds of encounters. Let's say you're going out on a group outing. Let's say you're going hiking. And one of the things that you enjoy is maybe you enjoy that people are on time. So now you have that as part of something that's one of your needs. So when you want to communicate to someone else, being prompt is obviously very important. Some people, that's not really an issue because they're much more laid back. They tend to go with the flow kind of thing. And these can be very easy people to have around because, they don't stress too much. Well, when you have someone that's more of a stickler for time, and you may be one of those, well, it's important to know that. And that's what I'm talking about, in being able to communicate your own needs. That's a very important aspect because I'm a person that tends to be pretty flexible on the time thing, and I understand my impact on other people. So I tend to take more emphasis on meeting someone else's need when it comes to time issues than my own. But if you're one of those individuals where the time on the clock, if it's 7:30, then it needs to start at 7:30, then that's something to communicate. Another thing is when you have preferences on whether you're a smoker or not a smoker. If you're communicating your need to, let's say, a potential partner about your own needs in this regard, some people don't do well with secondhand smoke, and for them it's a deal breaker. And I've known many people that have that as part of their baseline. It's a deal breaker. If they're a smoker, then they can't be with that because they live a different aspect. And I'm not making a judgment on whether smoking is good or not good. You get to make that decision on your own. It's whether when it's an important issue for you that you communicate that. And even and another one is basically, if you're health conscious, the kind of foods you choose to eat. Some it's merely a choice. Some can choose to have pizza. Some could choose to not have pizza. Well, if you're an individual that's very sensitive to dairy products, then pizza is certainly off your list, and you can't have that. And for you, it would be important to communicate that. Now, I know a lot of people that have very high sensitivity to certain foods. That's a nut allergy, dairy products, and some people, because of their own personal choices, choose to eat more of a vegan or vegetarian type diet. And all of these are very, very important aspects. And the reason you're going to communicate this, here's where the relationship part comes in. And it doesn't matter who you're in a relationship with, whether it's, your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, children, whatever. Communicating these needs, because these things obviously evolve over time. I know people who have had issues with what they can eat more so later in life. They may not have been a diabetic when they were young, but as they got older, for some sort of medical reason, they now have these issues to contend with. And when you're taking on somebody in your life, these things obviously become very important. In some cases, it can be life-threatening. So you need to communicate that. It's not something that someone can look at you and decide that they're going to be able to make the right decision. or the right choices for you. You have to share these things. Now, some of the examples I've given are more in line with something that's very health related, but that's just an aspect of where we're thinking. If we want to talk about your sexual needs, and that's very health, but relationship, that's a need. That could be a deal breaker for some people. They like it 2 or 3 times a week. Some it's a little more relaxed, some it's a little more, but communicating that and knowing. So how do you get to know that information? Now, on the health things, obviously you've grown to learn this. You've been in communication with your doctors. You've experienced your lifestyle and the choices you want to make. These other things, such as your sexual needs, you've had relationships, and when you've had a breakdown in a prior relationship because of that kind of need, and you're not feeling fulfilled, well, then you're going to want to be able to come into your next relationship and talk about that, and get a reaction, and understand that this is something that's important to you. And it's really good that you do these things up front, because sometimes it seems a bit deceptive to your partner if you bring this up later, and it's something that could be very serious. It could have a lot of impact. And I'm talking about the sexual issue. I'm talking about if you're a non-smoker and you're dating somebody who is, well, that is probably something that's going to loom very big for you in the relationship. Because if you bring this up at a later date, you're going to have to ask yourself, well, why did you wait so long to make this an issue? Because if you're doing that to not only the other person, but yourself, then you're not being authentic. And that's something about this, knowing what your own needs, that's something you have to face. And you should do that before you get into a relationship. Authenticity is one of the first steps. And knowing yourself, that's one of the first steps to being able to have a great relationship. I'm going to need to pause for a moment, and when I come right back, I'm going to talk about being authentic. Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. And before the last short pause, I said something about authenticity. And I'm bringing that up because I've been talking about knowing your own needs and how we go about communicating that. In the last segment, I kind of left off with, like I said, beginning about learning authentic behavior. And this is something that when you're communicating what your needs are to another person, you really need to have that baseline, that authenticity that comes with you and your character, so that when you're communicating something, it's understood, it's believable. Because what happens is often people try very hard. They mask so many things, meaning it's not just only that they try hard to mask them, but it almost seems like it's deception. In the persona or the character that you're showing to other people because you want them to like you. And when you're being authentic, it's not about having that mask on, but it's about showing vulnerability, even if it's early. And that vulnerability is more honest. We all have children are able to do this, and I'm going to use that example. Children are very honest. They say what's on their mind, and they don't come with a lot of preconceived notions about what the world is. They tend to experience the world as it is, from their perception, and then grow from there. Now, if kids wind up growing with a lot of fears, then their reaction to the world is going to be very fearful. But kids that are able to grow up with fewer fears tend to seem to have that devil may care attitude. They're just light and they're airy, and it's very fun to watch. What happens with adults is as they grow up and have their experiences, they grow layers and layers and layers of protection. And when I'm talking about authenticity, it's about peeling back those layers and being able to see the core of who you are. And that's what we call, that core is really about vulnerability and sharing that. And we get lost behind these layers of the onion because of our self-protect mechanism. And part of it is just about survival. I mean, we obviously can't be splayed open all the time because we get hurt emotionally and just not be able to function. But when we're moving into that place of having a relationship that's important to us, knowing your own needs and having some vulnerability about sharing what those are really helps you get what you want. And that's ultimately what this podcast is about, is helping you get what you want. And how do you go about doing it? It's not about the deception, because that ultimately plays into the side of dishonesty. And I don't think that that's what you want. And it even, when it lands on another person and they find out it's not what they originally had understood, that is because you didn't tell them the truth, then it leads to some tension. It leads to having to rearrange your thought process. I mean, were you deceived? It leads to a big breakdown in communication, because I know how often you start down one road and you have a belief, and then you've been traveling along, and then you find out that you've totally misunderstood something. And, the reaction to that could be, it could be very upsetting. You could feel like you've been cheated or you've been lied to. And while it could have everything to do with wanting to feel safe about being vulnerable, being authentic is about peeling back those layers, about sharing what's really there for you, and not always being worried about what the outcome is going to be from the other person. Because I think that will play into it at another time. I think if you be honest with who you are and what you're about, and then wait for the reaction, because people are going to react. And even at first, if it's not what you like, at least give them the other person an opportunity to set with it. Because I can tell you, from having lived life myself, it's very refreshing to have someone to be open and honest and vulnerable. It's oftentimes it's a surprise. Again, kids do this very easy because they haven't lived life to the extent that they know that there's things like being politically correct and you have to be careful with what you say because you don't want to hurt other people's feelings. Kids don't necessarily know that. They learn that kind of behavior from people that care for them, for their caregivers. So on that end, that's why children are so refreshing to be around. But as you get older, that childlike enthusiasm changes because of all the responsibilities we have. And when that happens to you as an adult, and then you're trying to develop relationships with those same types of behavior, then you have to kick in all kinds of workarounds in order to get to that place where we're open and honest. So, again, back to communicating your needs. When you can say what those are, be it that you want sex a certain number of times, or you prefer to go bowling on Tuesdays, or you like to take drives, or you like to hike, or you like to ski, or whatever your recreation is, or the other things that are important, especially in relationships. It's about how you spend your quality time. Which, I just gave you a few examples, but some things are real specific. Some people are really into traditions, and here's an example around Christmas. Some people love to open presents the day before Christmas, the 25th. Some people want to have a big dinner and those kinds of things. So what are your needs? Communicate those needs, and then start to work with your partner about how we can both get what we want. Because if you have a desire to have a big party for Christmas, that is a Christmas dinner, and your partner doesn't, well, how are you going to work that? What's your priority? You're going to have to discuss and negotiate those things based on what you feel is best for the relationship. And remember, we're talking about what's best for the relationship, because you can't always get exactly what you want, but it's about negotiating, being willing to be flexible, being willing to negotiate. That's an important skill. That's an important trait to have in a relationship that's going to last long term, because you can have relationships with partners that are into giving ultimatums, but I can tell you that isn't necessarily something that's going to last. It builds resentment. And when you have resentment, then what tends to happen is there's some passive aggressive things that go on. And that's another thing where people start hiding behind other intentions. They'll tell you something to your face and then do something else. And that generally doesn't feel very good. So getting what your needs are, figuring out what your needs are, that's something you have to put some time into, put some thought, get in a quiet space, think about your life, think about what's important to you, and also learn to consider what it is to be open-minded about new things, new ideas. I'm going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I'm going to close this segment with what's called an apology. The apology is when someone has had a bad experience, a negative experience. When we say I'm sorry, we're doing that to try to help that experience, that the effect of that pass, so that we can get to the healing portion of it. And we do this a lot for our friends. And ladies, women are generally very good at showing and sharing the emotions in a relationship. And what's particularly unique is we've done studies, and we talk about the vocal quality. And when you use a voice that's very soft and very feminine, then the apologies seem to really, it just seems to soothe you. When it's done with a voice that's coarse and harsh, then the apology does not seem to land the same way. It almost seems as if it's very abrupt, and it's very scary. It doesn't land the same. So women have, to me, they seem to have a special talent for this. I know my mom was really good at this thing. But what I want to share is the importance of being able to give an apology, and to also share that it's not always that it's your fault, and being able to extend that sort of comfort and not feel guilty about it is a very important human emotional relationship quality to have. Here's why. When someone feels injured, they're not necessarily going to know all the reasons they feel that way, but if, let's say, you're a person who might be to blame for whatever went on that hurt someone. They're going to want to hear an apology before they hear anything else. If you like to give an apology and then explain, that's how you're going to need to start. You're going to need to apologize. Hey, I'm sorry that what I did, hurt your feelings, and, maybe I can explain. And then you can begin to clear up the confusion, and then the upset can go away. Quite often, and I call it extending an olive branch, because I find that's very important to be able to do in a relationship. You find sometimes relationships have that quality in which one person is the leader, the other person is a follower, so that person is generally expected to step up and make sort of those overtures. And I think that's important. You have to understand where you are in your relationship, who has that role, because we all have roles in our relationships. But I think it's important where you understand that an apology can mean so much to someone, and to be able to give the gift of trying to help heal someone else's feelings with an apology and being able to discuss things. Now, I think it's important to be able to learn how not to take everything personal when someone is sharing their feelings about what's hurt them. Because if you take it personal, you're obviously going to have a reaction that may shut down the other individual. And what we need to understand about sharing feelings. Now, therapists do this all the time in their sessions. Now, basically, they're a neutral party. So they're not really going to feel guilty about something because they're trying to get the client to speak out. So I'm kind of giving you a tip here as to why therapy sessions tend to work. But when you're in your own relationship, because of the emotional component, you may be the target, or you may be the reason. Let me say it that way. You may be the reason some of these things have upset someone. So you have to be in a place of listening, and it may be very, very difficult to sit there and listen because you're feeling like you're being blamed for something. Sometimes you are. Sometimes you are the reason that problems happen. But you need to be able to learn how to listen and to be able to apologize, because that's what helps get this thing back on track. And early on in this podcast, I was talking about being authentic. I also shared about, knowing your own needs. And this is something that people oftentimes overlook. It's the need to have someone in your life who will be accountable for things, for you, accountable to you, and being able to apologize when they do things that aren't right. It's not something that we all necessarily grow up learning how to do. We learn to expect it because we certainly get angry. But being able to extend that, not everyone is very good at that. And I think that's something you need to practice. But you need to practice because you need to understand, how do you do that? And you do it by empathy. You put yourself in the other person's shoes for a while. Understand how they're feeling. And they don't have to necessarily be in the place of justifying it. But learning to be a good listener will learn to help you be a good partner. And that also works the direction of helping you knowing what your needs are. Because if you want to be if you need to be a good listener, you're probably going to want your partner to be a good listener. So it works both ways. And you can work those things out, and especially knowing them ahead of time before you have to need them. But if you get into that spot where you're unpracticed at this and you're trying to figure it out, I'm just going to share it this way. First, be compassionate. Understand that knowing that the other person is feeling hurt. Know that you yourself aren't always to blame for everything that goes wrong. So that should help make it easier for you to listen and give you some objectivity and stand aside. And if you need to write down notes and things, because sometimes if as you're writing some of the high points, you can see that there's a connection. And by learning that, then you can begin to see where the problem lies. And you can help heal your own relationships by doing that. Doing a little note-taking, learning some diplomacy, the apologies, because those are really important for long-term relationships. You got to learn how to be able to do that. And it sort of kind of makes you unique, too, to be able to utilize that tip, because quite often we're so self-focused that we know what we want from somebody else in that regard. We want somebody else to be accountable to us for the things that they do to us. But when it comes to vice versa, that's a little harder to do. So anyway, I think you get my point. And I'm going to end by saying thank you for listening. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast. And until next time.